Okay, so welcome to the deep dive. We're going to be diving into a topic that's pretty fundamental. I mean, it's how flowering plants actually make more flowering plants.
It's something we all kind of take for granted. You see flowers, you see fruits, but the underlying processes are incredibly complex and fascinating.
Exactly. And we've got this chapter, H38.pdf, that a listener sent in. It's dense, packed with information.
It is. It's like a deep dive into the reproductive world of angiosperms, and not just how they do their thing naturally, but also how we've been messing with their systems, through breeding and now with all this biotechnology.
Right, and we're going to unpack all of that. The key theories, the core concepts, what the research tells us, some real-world examples.
By the end of this, you'll have a really solid grasp of angiosperm reproduction and the biotech that's shaping the future of plants, and really the future of food and energy.
So to kick things off, the chapter kind of sets the stage by reminding us that angiosperms are the dominant plant life form in most terrestrial ecosystems.
Yeah, and their reproductive strategies are crucial not just for natural ecosystems, but also for agriculture. I mean, think about all the crops we depend on.
Right, so understanding how they reproduce is kind of a big deal, and it all starts with what makes their life cycle unique.
And that boils down to the three F's, as the chapter puts it: flowers, double fertilization, and fruits. It's a nice, simple way to remember the big innovations.
But before we jump into those, the chapter takes us back to basics with the general plant life cycle, which involves this alternation of generations.
Yeah, for anyone who needs a quick refresher, all plants alternate between two multicellular generations. You've got the gametophyte generation, which produces gametes, the sperm and egg cells.
And that's haploid, right?
Exactly, haploid, just one set of chromosomes. And then you have the sporophyte generation, which produces spores, and that's diploid, two sets of chromosomes.
And the spores develop into gametophytes, which then produce the gametes. When fertilization happens, you get a diploid zygote, which grows into a new sporophyte.
Now, the evolutionary trend in plants has been towards having a dominant sporophyte generation. And angiosperms, they've taken this to the extreme. The sporophyte is what we typically think of as the plant itself, the big leafy thing.
So the flowering plant we see is the sporophyte, and those flowers are a specialized structure within that sporophyte for sexual reproduction.
Right, and they have this really intricate organization. A typical flower is made up of four types of floral organs arranged in these concentric rings called whorls, all attached to the receptacle, which is kind of like the base of the flower.
So it's like a series of layers, starting from the inside out.
Exactly. The innermost layer is made up of the carpels, then you have the stamens, then the petals, and finally the outermost layer is the sepals.
And not all these parts are directly involved in the baby-making process, right? Some are more about support or attraction.
Yeah, you've got the carpels and stamens, which are the sporophylls. These are modified leaves that are all about reproduction. The sepals and petals, though, they're sterile modified leaves. Their role is more about protection or attracting pollinators.
Okay, let's zoom in on the reproductive structures, starting with the carpel, which houses the female reproductive parts.
So at the base of the carpel, you've got the ovary, and inside the ovary, you've got one or more ovules. If fertilization happens, those ovules develop into seeds. Extending from the ovary is the style, which is a stalk-like structure, and at the top of the style is the stigma.
And the stigma is kind of sticky, right?
Exactly. It's specialized to capture pollen. Now, a flower can have a single carpel, and in that case, the whole structure is called a simple pistil. Or it can have multiple carpels, and these carpels are often fused together, forming a compound ovary, and the whole thing together is called a compound pistil.
So whether it's single or a fused group, the carpel is all about protecting those potential seeds and providing a landing pad for pollen. Now, what about the stamen, the male counterpart?
Okay, so the stamen, or microsporophyll, has a filament, which is the stalk that supports it, and at the top you've got the anther.
And inside the anther.
Inside the anther are these chambers called microsporangia, or pollen sacs, and that's where pollen grains are produced.
Through meiosis, right?
Right, so you've got the carpels producing the female gametophyte, and the stamens producing the male gametophyte, which is the pollen grain.
And then you've got the petals and the sepals. Those are more about attracting attention and protection, right?
Yeah. Petals are usually the showy part of the flower, often brightly colored, and their main job is to attract pollinators. Sepals, on the other hand, are usually green and leaf-like. They enclose and protect the flower bud before it opens.
The chapter also talks about complete and incomplete flowers. What's the difference?
So a complete flower has all four of those floral organs we just talked about. Carpels, stamens, petals, and sepals. An incomplete flower is missing one or more of those.
Like some flowers might not have petals.
Exactly. Grass flowers are a good example. They usually lack petals.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And it's not just about the parts, right? I mean, flowers are incredibly diverse.
Oh, absolutely. They come in a mind-blowing array of sizes, shapes, colors, scents. Some are tiny, some are huge. Some smell amazing, some smell like rotting meat.
It's all about attracting the right pollinator.
Exactly. Which brings us to the next F, pollination.
The crucial step of getting that pollen from the anther to the stigma.
And there are a couple of ways this can happen. It can be biotic, meaning it involves living things like animals, or it can be abiotic, meaning it involves non-living things like wind or water.
And the vast majority of angiosperms rely on biotic pollination, right?
Yeah, about 80%. And within biotic pollination, insects are the biggest players, especially bees.
Right. Bees are like the pollination superstars.
Totally. Flowers that are pollinated by bees are often brightly colored, usually yellow or blue, and they often have a sweet scent. They can also have these ultraviolet patterns called nectar guides that we can't see, but bees can, and those guides lead them right to the nectar.
And then you've got moths and butterflies, which also pollinate a lot of plants.
Yeah, and they have their own preferences. Moth-pollinated flowers tend to be white or pale, so they stand out at night, and they often have a strong, sweet fragrance that's released in the evening.
Because moths are mostly active at night, right?
Exactly. Butterfly-pollinated flowers, on the other hand, tend to be brightly colored and often have a landing platform for the butterflies.
What about flies? I don't usually think of flies as pollinators.
They are, but they tend to be attracted to flowers that are, well, a little less appealing to us, reddish or brown, fleshy looking, and often with an odor that mimics rotting meat or dung.
Oh, yuck.
It makes sense though, right? They're looking for places to lay their eggs.
Right. And then there are bats. I always find bat pollination fascinating.
It is pretty cool. Bat-pollinated flowers tend to be light-colored, so they're visible at night, and they often have a strong, musky scent. They also tend to produce a lot of nectar.
Because bats need a lot of energy to fly.
Exactly. And then you've got birds, which are also important pollinators.
Hummingbirds are the classic example, right?
Yeah. Hummingbirds and other bird pollinators are attracted to flowers that are large and bright, often red or orange, and that produce a lot of nectar. But they usually don't have a strong scent because birds don't have a great sense of smell.
So these relationships between plants and their pollinators have evolved over millions of years.
Mm.
The chapter talks about this concept of coevolution, where two species evolve together in response to each other.
Right, like with the Madagascar orchid and Darwin's hawk moth. The orchid has this incredibly long nectar spur, and Darwin predicted that there must be a moth with a tongue long enough to reach the nectar. And sure enough, years later, they discovered a moth with a proboscis that was over 10 inches long.
That's amazing.
It is. And it shows how the adaptations in one species can drive the evolution of adaptations in another.
But the chapter also raises a concerning point. Climate change is disrupting these delicate plant-pollinator relationships.
Yeah, it's a big problem. Changes in temperature and precipitation patterns can affect when plants flower and when pollinators are active, which can lead to mismatches, like the example in the chapter of flowers that require long-tongued pollinators declining in the Rocky Mountains because of warmer temperatures.
Right, and those changes can cascade through the ecosystem, affecting other species that depend on those plants and pollinators.
Exactly. It's a reminder of how interconnected everything is and how delicate these balances are.
Okay, so let's say pollination is successful. The pollen grain lands on the stigma. What happens next?
Okay, so now we move into the process of fertilization. And in angiosperms, it's not just fertilization, it's double fertilization. Remember that second F?
Yeah, it's a unique feature of flowering plants.
Right. But before we get to the double part, we have to understand what's going on with the pollen grain. So when a pollen grain lands on a stigma, it absorbs moisture and germinates, which means it starts to grow a pollen tube.
And this tube grows down through the style towards the ovary.
Exactly. It's guided by chemical signals from the ovule, and it eventually enters the ovule through a tiny opening called the micropyle.
And the pollen tube doesn't just contain one sperm cell, right?
No, it contains two. And this is where the double in double fertilization comes in. One sperm cell fuses with the egg cell, which is the female gamete, and that forms a diploid zygote, which will eventually develop into the embryo.
And that's pretty standard, right? That happens in other organisms, too.
Right. But the other sperm cell does something totally unique to angiosperms. It fuses with the central cell of the female gametophyte, which contains two nuclei called polar nuclei.
So you get this weird three-way fusion.
Exactly. And this fusion produces a triploid nucleus, which means it has 3 sets of chromosomes. And this triploid cell will develop into the endosperm.
And what's the endosperm?
It's the tissue that provides nourishment for the developing embryo. Like the white, fluffy part of a popcorn kernel, that's endosperm.
So it's like a built-in food supply.
Right, and double fertilization is super efficient. The endosperm only develops if fertilization is successful, so the plant doesn't waste energy on producing food for seeds that aren't going to be viable.
So after double fertilization, you've got the ovule developing into a seed, which is our third F, and the ovary developing into a fruit.
Exactly, and the seed, it's basically a dormant embryo along with a food supply either in the endosperm or in special seed leaves called cotyledons, and a protective outer layer called the seed coat.
And this dormant embryo can hang out for a while, waiting for the right conditions to germinate.
Yeah, some seeds can stay dormant for years, even decades.
That's incredible. Okay, so we've talked about the seed. What about the fruit? What's its role?
Well, the fruit serves 2 main purposes. First, it protects the developing seeds, and second, it helps to disperse those seeds to new locations.
So it's like a vehicle for spreading the plant's offspring.
Exactly, and fruits come in all shapes and sizes depending on how they're dispersed. Some are fleshy and sweet, attracting animals to eat them and spread the seeds in their droppings.
Like berries, for example.
Right. Others are dry and have wings or hooks that help them to be carried by the wind or to hitch a ride on animals.
Like dandelion seeds or burrs.
Exactly. The diversity of fruit adaptations is amazing.
So, we've covered sexual reproduction in angiosperms. But the chapter also emphasizes that they can reproduce asexually as well.
Yeah, Concept 38.2 dives into that. Asexual reproduction is all about producing offspring that are genetically identical to the parent. It's basically cloning.
And plants are really good at this, right?
They are. One way they do it is through fragmentation, where a piece of the parent plant breaks off and develops into a new individual.
Like with succulents, you can just break off a leaf and stick it in the ground and it'll grow.
Exactly. Another way is through vegetative spread, where new shoots grow from the roots or rhizomes of the parent plant.
Like with aspen trees, you often see a whole grove of trees that are actually all clones of a single parent tree.
Right. And then there's apomixis, which is a really interesting one.
What oppa makes it?
It's basically asexual seed production. The plant produces seeds without fertilization. So you get offspring that are genetically identical to the parent, but they can be dispersed like regular seeds.
So it's like cloning with the added benefit of seed dispersal.
Exactly. And this is something that plant breeders are really interested in because it could allow them to produce true breeding hybrid crops.
So each generation would be identical to the previous one. That could be huge for agriculture.
It could be, but there are some downsides to asexual reproduction too.
Like what?
Well, the biggest one is the lack of genetic diversity. If all the individuals in a population are genetically identical, they're all equally susceptible to diseases and environmental changes.
So if a new disease comes along, it could wipe out the entire population.
Exactly. Whereas with sexual reproduction, you get that genetic shuffling, which leads to variation. So some individuals might be more resistant to the disease and survive.
So both sexual and asexual reproduction have their pros and cons.
Exactly. It's all about trade-offs and what works best for the plant in its particular environment.
Now, the chapter also talks about self-fertilization, or selfing. Some plants can actually fertilize themselves.
Yeah, but selfing can be problematic in the long run. It leads to inbreeding, which can result in offspring that are less vigorous and less fertile.
Because harmful recessive alleles are more likely to be expressed when you have inbreeding.
Exactly. So most plants have evolved mechanisms to avoid selfing and promote cross-pollination.
Like what?
Well, some plants have separate male and female flowers, either on the same plant or on different plants.
So the pollen from one plant has to reach the stigma of another plant.
Right. Others have mechanisms that prevent pollen from germinating on the stigma of the same flower, or they have different timing for when the pollen is released and when the stigma is receptive.
So they're making it difficult for themselves to self-fertilize.
Exactly. They've evolved to maximize genetic diversity.
And the chapter also mentions self-incompatibility, which is a really interesting mechanism.
Yeah, self-incompatibility is basically a genetic system that allows plants to recognize and reject their own pollen. So, if a pollen grain lands on the stigma of a flower from the same plant, it won't be able to fertilize the egg.
It's like the plant is saying, nope, not happening.
Right. And there are 2 main types of self-incompatibility. One is gametophytic self-incompatibility, where the compatibility is determined by the genotype of the pollen grain itself.
So if the pollen grain has the same alleles as the stigma, it's rejected.
Exactly. And the other type is sporophytic self-incompatibility, where the compatibility is determined by the genotype of the parent plant that produced the pollen.
So even if the pollen grain has different alleles than the stigma, it can still be rejected if those alleles match the alleles of the parent plant.
Right. And these self-incompatibility systems are super important for maintaining genetic diversity in plant populations.
So we've covered natural reproduction and angiosperms, both sexual and asexual. Now let's move on to how humans have been tinkering with plant reproduction to improve crops.
Yeah, Concept 38.3 delves into that. It starts by reminding us that humans have been manipulating plant reproduction for thousands of years, long before we even understood what genes were.
Right. We've been selectively breeding plants to improve their traits since the dawn of agriculture.
Exactly. The example the chapter gives is the evolution of maize from teosinte.
Which is a wild grass that looks nothing like the corn we eat today.
Right. But through generations of selective breeding, humans transformed teosinte into maize, which has much larger and more nutritious kernels.
It's an incredible example of the power of artificial selection.
It really is. And traditional plant breeding techniques are still widely used today. It basically involves crossing different varieties or even different species that have desirable traits, and then selecting the offspring that have the best combination of those traits.
And this process can be repeated over multiple generations to further improve the crop.
Right. But traditional breeding can be time-consuming and unpredictable, and it's limited to the genes that are already present in the species you're working with.
Which brings us to the more recent advancements in plant biotechnology and genetic engineering.
Exactly. With genetic engineering, we can manipulate the genes of plants in a much more precise and targeted way.
Like with GMOs, genetically modified organisms.
Right. GMOs are created by inserting genes from other organisms into the plant's genome. This allows us to introduce traits that would be impossible to achieve through traditional breeding.
Like resistance to pests or herbicides.
Exactly. And the development of powerful new tools like CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing has revolutionized genetic engineering.
CRISPR allows us to make very specific changes to the plant's DNA.
Right. We can edit existing genes or insert new genes with incredible precision, and this technology has the potential to really transform agriculture.
The chapter highlights two main goals for plant biotechnology: reducing world hunger and malnutrition, and reducing fossil fuel dependency.
Those are big goals, and biotechnology has the potential to make a real difference in both of those areas.
Let's talk about reducing world hunger first. One of the key approaches is developing crops that are resistant to pests and diseases.
Right, like paprika crops, which are engineered to produce a protein that's toxic to certain insect pests.
So farmers don't have to spray as many pesticides.
Exactly. And that's good for the environment and for human health.
Another approach is biofortification, which is basically increasing the nutritional value of crops.
Like golden rice, which was engineered to produce beta-carotene, a precursor to vitamin A.
Vitamin A deficiency is a major problem in developing countries, leading to blindness and other health issues.
Right, and golden rice has the potential to address that by providing a source of vitamin A in a staple food crop.
It's a really promising example of how biotechnology can improve human health.
It is, and there are many other examples of biofortification efforts, like increasing the iron and zinc content of staple crops.
Now, what about reducing fossil fuel dependency? How can biotechnology help with that?
One way is by developing biofuels from plant biomass.
So instead of burning fossil fuels, we could burn plant-based fuels.
Exactly. And these biofuels could be produced from crops like switchgrass or poplar, which can be grown on marginal lands that aren't suitable for food production.
So it wouldn't compete with food production.
Right. And the research in this area is focused on improving the efficiency of converting plant biomass into biofuels.
Now, of course, the use of GMOs has been controversial. The chapter addresses some of the main concerns that people have.
Yeah. There are concerns about human health, environmental impacts, and the potential for transgene escape.
So let's talk about human health concerns first. Is there any evidence that GMOs are harmful to eat?
So far, the scientific consensus is that approved GMOs are safe to eat. There's no credible evidence that they've caused any adverse health effects.
But what about the possibility of allergens being transferred from one species to another?
That's a valid concern, but regulatory agencies have strict testing procedures in place to assess the allergenic potential of new GM crops before they're approved for consumption.
So if a new GM crop contains a known allergen, it wouldn't be approved.
Right. And sometimes genetic engineering can actually make foods safer by reducing the levels of naturally occurring toxins.
Okay, what about environmental impacts?
One concern is the potential for harm to non-target organisms, like beneficial insects. But the evidence suggests that the use of bee crops, for example, has actually led to a decrease in insecticide use, which is good for beneficial insects.
And what about the risk of transgene escape? Genes from GM crops getting into wild populations.
That's a possibility. But the likelihood depends on several factors, like whether the GM crop has any sexually compatible wild relatives in the area.
And if it does, there's a chance that those genes could spread.
Right. But there are strategies to mitigate that risk, like engineering male sterility into the GM crop or growing it in areas where there are no wild relatives nearby.
So it's all about careful risk assessment and management.
Exactly. There are potential risks with any new technology, and it's important to evaluate those risks carefully. But the potential benefits of plant biotechnology are enormous.
The chapter ends by emphasizing that the debate over plant biotechnology is ongoing and that it's important to approach this topic with a balanced perspective, considering both the potential benefits and risks.
I think that's really key. We need to base our decisions on sound science and avoid making decisions based on fear or hype.
Well said. This has been a really fascinating and thought-provoking deep dive into the world of angiosperm reproduction and biotechnology.
I agree. It's amazing how complex and intricate these processes are and how much we've learned about them, but there's still so much more to discover.
And as our understanding of plant biology continues to grow, so too will our ability to harness the power of plants to address some of the biggest challenges facing humanity.
I think that's a great point to leave our listeners with.
So, with all that said, what do you think about how this all connects back to, how does it connect back to our own lives, to the future of food and agriculture? It's something to really ponder.
I completely agree. And, with these advancements in genetic engineering, what ethical considerations should be guiding our decisions? It's a question we all need to be thinking about.
Absolutely. It's not just about the science, but also about the societal implications. So to all our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you learned something new and that it sparked some interesting thoughts and questions.
And if you're interested in learning more, we encourage you to take another look at the chapter we discussed today and to explore some of the resources and links we'll be providing in the show notes.
Until next time.
Take care.